Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. It's my third year here, first time presenting on my own paper, so I'm very excited to be here. So while I get started, this is joint work with Jason Allen and Ben Kenny. Jason and I were formerly at the Bank of Canada. It's a great place to be, and we have some bank employees here. And like Philippe said, I'm now at U of T. So the views, we're not sure if we have to still say this, but we're going to say that the views expressed here are ours and not those of the Bank of Canada. This is our first time presenting the paper, so hopefully I don't say anything I shouldn't say. So this is about evaluating credit card minimum payment restrictions. The starting point for this paper, this kind of very broad agenda, is how can policymakers help households improve their financial health? And this is kind of intentionally very vague. Lots of different ways policymakers try to help people, force people to make better financial decisions. The first kind of very big area are nudges, right? So these are targeted at biases, they steer actions, they reduce frictions. And although they are somewhat effective, there is this evidence that they kind of have a limited efficacy, especially in the credit card space. So you have papers by my co-author, Kenny, Ben, Adams, all 2022, where, especially with credit cards, it seems to help people temporarily kind of behave a little bit better, but then down the road, they kind of revert back to their old behavior. So nudges, effective in some domains. In this domain with credit cards, not super effective. Another big area of regulation is disclosure. So you have in the States a Schumer box that kind of puts front and center exactly what a credit card payment structure is like. This is supposed to tackle biased beliefs or financial literacy. I'm not sure exactly how my credit card is set up, and therefore when you have the Schumer box, it's going to help people understand. Turns out, doesn't work that well. So in the US, there's evidence it doesn't work very well. In Mexico and the UK, and if you do work in financial literacy, this is not super surprising in that it's not typically about just disclosing information. You must kind of help people a little bit more. So broadly speaking, a lot of really good ideas coming from psychology and marketing. And then in the econ finance world, there's this increased recognition that nudges and these kinds of things are not enough. So going back to our primary question, there's this new push that there's a need to evaluate hard paternalism. And our esteemed keynote speaker, David Leibson, has a really nice paper on this. And there's others who have nice papers on that say, nudges and those kinds of things, they do help. But at some point, it might be prudent for the regulator to put their foot down and say, we know what's better for you, and we're going to kind of steer you towards working that direction. And that's what paternalism is. Really, in a nutshell, it's about restricting consumer choice. Because economists, we think, should never really happen. Typically, people, if you give them all the options, they should rationally choose what's best for them, and that's typically well for improving, unless there's some kind of frictions. Now, in particular, we can think about why paternalism might be good or bad. So John Campbell, in his 2016 address, has this really nice quote: "If nudges are unavailable or inadequate, consumer financial regulation must confront the trade-off between the benefits of intervention to behavioral agents and the cost to rational agents." And in the credit card space, thinking about minimum payments, there's a really neat way to think about this, and this is from McKees and Jane paper and others have worked in this space, about what are credit card minimum payments. Right? There's a long history of why they're implemented, which is a little bit kind of far in the past, and now we just have payments for institutional reasons. But think about when you get your credit card statement, you might see really two numbers. The first is your statement balance, and the second is the minimum payment. Those are really the two big numbers that you see. For many households, they simply cannot afford to make the full payment. That is completely out of the question for them. The other number they see is the minimum payment, and they can afford to make that number. And it's actually a pretty hard problem to think about. If I'm not making the full payment, if I'm not making the minimum payment, what should my payment be? So a large literature says that people either make the full payment, they're transactors, someone like me, where I book everything on my credit card, but I always pay the full balance. So I'm a fully rational agent in that sense. And then you have others who make the minimum payment. And that could be because they're behavioral, they don't know what to do, so they anchor to the minimum payment that they see. Either the payment itself, some people round up to the nearest whole number. There's a lot of clustering at round numbers, as you'd imagine. But then there might be people that are making the minimum payment because of liquidity constraints. So these are rational agents, and they're making the minimum payments because that's all they can afford to do. And we're worried about these people if you change minimum payments. So what we're trying to do in this paper is to think about these trade-offs very carefully. So we want to quantify the trade-offs, the costs and benefits of a hard paternalistic policy that imposes minimum credit card payments. We can talk about whether it's truly a hard constraint or a softer constraint, but really this paper is going to say there are costs, there are benefits. We want to take a first attempt at quantifying these things in a sense so that we can have more fruitful discussions about what is good and what is bad. The setting that we're going to use is the Canadian credit card market, in particular, beautiful Quebec, where we are right now. So in 2019, the Quebec provincial government introduced this paternalistic legislation to prevent over-indebtedness. Now, if you live in Canada, like I grew up in Canada, you know that Quebec always does a bit of its own thing, right? So you might watch TV, and there's a commercial that says Tim Hortons has this contest open to everyone in Canada above the age of 18 who doesn't live in Quebec. So Quebec is always doing its own thing, and that's kind of good for us in this sense, because Quebec kind of almost unilaterally decided the federal regulator is taking too long, we're going to do our own thing, and that's good for us in terms of identification. Now the way we think about this as paternalism is that with these new minimums, the government is restricting choices of how much households must pay to remain in good standing. Okay, and in the sense that when you restrict how much people are paying, you're also restricting how much they can roll over. So the decision about how much to make as a minimum payment is also a decision about how much people can revolve that. So the question we're going to ask is, what are the costs and benefits of this paternalistic policy? It's not obvious actually whether this is a good policy or a bad policy. If you look to the theory, it's ambiguous, and that's what we as economists love, thinking about the trade-offs. So let's talk through some of the benefits and costs. The first benefit, quite obviously, is a reduction in credit card debt. And this is going to have two ways that we think this is a quote-unquote good thing. Number one, you increase disposable income, because when you have less credit card debt, down the road you're making less total interest payments. And in each period, you're having that increased liquidity from having less interest payments. Further, by reducing the stock of debt that households hold, you're improving their financial health. And this is kind of a very big, broad term, but generally speaking, we think that it's better for people to have the same level of consumption for a lower level of debt, right? We want them to be not as exposed to monetary policy shocks, want them to have better financial health in case they're hit with some other shock. We think in general it's better for people to have less debt overall for financial stability reasons. On the cost side, however, you can imagine this is going to impose an increase in delinquencies. If you suddenly tell people you have to make a larger payment, and if there are liquidity constraints, as we discussed, which might be the case, this is going to increase delinquency for those that are bound by those liquidity constraints. Now there's another cost you can think about, that in general equilibrium, there's going to be a reduced supply of debt. Right? If I'm a credit card issuer, and people have to make larger minimum payments, that's less profit for me as a credit card issuer. Right? So we have to think about the GE effects on the supply side. You're going to decrease lender profits, and therefore they're going to supply less credit. And to whom will they supply less credit? It's probably those who are already unable to get other forms of credit. So you're hitting that marginal borrower on credit card debt who's really affected by this kind of policy. So we want to think through all these different things, and thankfully our setting lets us do that. So we're going to use this natural experiment that occurred in Quebec, where the Protection Bureau decided to raise the minimum required credit card payments to at least 2% of the balance in 2019. And I'll talk exactly about what this policy is. We're going to use differences between Quebec and the neighboring province, Ontario. So if you're more familiar with the US, we have provinces in Canada, and they're similar to states. We are in Quebec now, and Ontario has Toronto, for example. So the provinces are very close to one another. There's places like in Ottawa where the Bank of Canada is, where you have the Ottawa side and the Quebec side. It's a commuting zone, tons of people live on both sides. So really just you cross that border, you issue a card, and you're subject to these different policies. The first stage is going to kind of show that it works, is that in August 2019 relative to July 2019, a 46% increase in average minimum payments, $23 in August 2019. So this is a very salient, a large policy. And I'll talk about how a lot of this ends up being driven by people who are involved. Right? So as we know from the literature, many people, most people, pay off the full balance every month and they use their credit card. For me, I love travel points. I wish to travel for free around the world. So I'm not affected by this as much as someone would be who's revolving the balance. Okay? Now for each of those 3 points I said, let me summarize kind of what we find. In terms of reducing credit card debt, what we find is a 3.4 decrease in revolving debt after 6 months. So a $64 decrease, which is a large number for this policy. Okay? This is a large number, but again, I haven't told you what the costs are. So it's large in levels, it's large in absolute terms, but we have to have a fuller discussion about this relative to the costs. And as I was saying, this kind of effect, and most of the effects I'm going to talk about today, are driven by revolvers. So the numbers are even larger, almost double. The revolvers, the ones who are really sensitive to this policy, are the ones who are going to see an even larger increase in debt, decrease in debt in terms of levels. It's a bit smaller in terms of percentages. Now, on the delinquency side, we do see an increase, a 10% increase in delinquency rates after 6 months. Now, 10% sounds like a huge number, and it is a big number of percentages, but the overall level of delinquency is very low. So it's about 1%, and it increases by about 0.1 percentage points. So that is a cost that is imposed. That is something that it's also persistent, this after 6 months. This is not just people who are perhaps adjusting to the new minimum payments. We observe that this does happen, and we see this increase in delinquency after 6 months. Okay? These are people who, for example, enter delinquency and can't seem to get out of it. This is going to be a lot noisier. We're doing a lot more work on this specific point to think about who exactly is becoming delinquent. But there is certainly the case that we observe a decrease in credit card debt and an increase in delinquency. Now finally, we're still working on this, and I'll show you a little bit today, but we do see kind of clean evidence of a reduced supply of credit card debt. And specifically because of the way the policy is implemented, you can think about if I'm a credit card lender, I want people to open a credit card before the policy. Because if you open a credit card after the policy, there's a second policy change that says all new cards have a 5% minimum. So there's a lot of push to get people to open credit cards just before the policy, and we find that there's less people who open new credit cards after the policy, and those people are also given lower credit limits. So there's a lot of supply effect too, and we're still working through those. So this is a preview of the main results, and I'll kind of go through them in a bit more detail. Any questions before we jump in? Okay, no water break for me. So, Quebec. Bill 134. Quebec has a very interesting history with this kind of policy, and Felipe has written a very nice paper on this, and he knows more. So there's this policy change that was discussed in 2011. It's kind of shelved at the time for various reasons, and it came back in 2017, and then it was eventually implemented in 2019. This is Bill 134, it's Consumer Protection Act. In general, if we think about credit card minimum payments, before August 2019, there were no minimum payment requirements anywhere in Canada. And by no minimum payment requirements, I mean the regulator is not imposing that credit card providers have to have a minimum payment. It is the case that many credit card providers do have their own minimum payment requirements, but it's not the regulator that's saying you must do this. Each kind of lender does their own thing. Starting from August 2019, this is only true in Quebec because Quebec decides to impose this policy. Now in Quebec, the Consumer Protection Bureau, they introduced this minimum payment policy, and it was part of this larger act, and this is I think one of the bigger parts of the act, and they say these changes are part of the measures adopted by the government to prevent indebtedness. And they're taking this very kind of paternalistic stance. It is advantageous to pay the balance of your credit card each month because no credit charges are then applicable. Right? This is the kind of thing you might see in a Personal Finance 101 course, or something where when someone gets a credit card, you talk to them about, hey, you have to make at least your minimum payments to remain in good standing, try to make more than that, and so on. So this is where the idea of paternalism comes in. This is a regulator telling people, you have a credit card, and we think it's good for you to pay down as much as you can. Okay, so this is not just a nudge or disclosure, this is them saying we're taking matters into our own hands. Now, there's some other quotes, this had a lot of political support. Right? So you have Lisa Turreau from the Quebec Liberal Party. The part that I highlighted there is that the practice has the effect of considerably extending the period during which the consumer pays only the minimum amounts, will have to repay the amount owed, and if increasing the amount of credit charges that will have to be paid to pay the balance in full. So our dear politicians, very wordy, but they're basically saying that people are not internalizing that if you double the minimum payment you're making, you're much more than halving how much time it takes you to pay down your debt. That's because of exponentiation, which we know that the average person is not super comfortable with. The idea here is really the regulator stepping in and saying, we know what's good for people. People are not able to kind of do this mental math very well. But at the same time, the regulator is aware that they don't want to jump in and kind of change the status quo too much. So the second quote, Catherine Fournier says, we find it good that we are increasing gradually to 5%, but we are afraid of the price shock that it could have on the most vulnerable consumers. So the ultimate goal is to raise it to 5%, but the way they actually implemented it, and this is what they post on their public website, was to have kind of two different policies. For all new cards open on August 1st, 2019, the minimum payment is 5%. So you open a new card, you're never going to be kind of quote-unquote exposed to the old regime. If you have an existing card, however, starting from August 1st, 2019, the minimum payment is 2%, and then it increases by 50 basis points every year until in August 2025, all Quebec credit cards have at least a 5% minimum payment. That's the policy. So the existing cards have this step up, where it starts on August 1st, 2019, and then every year increases by 50 basis points. But for all new cards open on August 1st, 2019 or later, the policy is 5%. Any questions here? Okay. No water break. So let's start looking at some data. So this is our control group in Ontario, and here I'm plotting the CDF of the minimum payment as a percentage of the statement balance. And there are actually two lines here. The yellow line is below the black line. Yellow line is for July 2019. Black line is for August 2019. So you can see a few things here. Number one, in the control group Ontario, there's no change between the 2 months, which is good news for us. We don't think there should be a change in the control group. And you can see there is, this bunching at 1%, so there are going to be some banks that say minimum payment is 1%, but for the most part, it's a relatively smooth function. Okay, now let's look at Quebec. This is our first stage. This is our figure 1 in the paper. July 2019, it actually looks remarkably similar to Ontario. But what you see is that starting in August 2019, as soon as the policy hits, there's this big shift. What we'd expect actually is that there's this huge clustering at 2%. That is the new policy, right? The new policy is that the banks must have their consumers having a 2% minimum payment. But lucky or unlucky for us, the banks also decided to do their own thing, and they heterogeneously implemented the policy. So this CDF is kind of showing our first stage. There's a little bit at 2%, there's a lot at 2.5%, and there's a bit at 3% as well. So what actually happened is that the banks, they knew this policy change was coming, of course, and they didn't necessarily want to implement 2%. So we, for example, talked to one bank, and we asked them, why did you not go to 2%? And their rationale was, our back-of-book software is horrible to use. And it's already a nightmare for us now to have to manage two kinds of cards, pre and post. So we only want to do two changes. We want to go once to 2.5 and once to 5%. If you think about the policy, that's totally kosher, right? The regulator didn't want people to do this, right? That was their whole point of doing the staggering. But they only told the banks the minimum payment you have to have is 2%. So the banks kind of took matters into their own hands as well, and we're going to exploit that a little bit too. So specifically, yes?
Can you say a word about where the variation is coming from? Like, why are some people getting a 7% minimum payment and other 2%?
Thanks. So the variation is coming from the fact that the minimum payment is going to be some dollar amount plus taxes, plus interest, plus fees. So that's where the minimum payment for most people is just a fraction of their balance, but the higher end is coming from people who have interest, for example. All the interest comes due right away. Yes?
Are these like realized minimum payments or like the bank's listings minimum payment?
This is realized. So we are observing at the card level.
If somebody decides to make a higher minimum payment, it will be here.
It won't be here. This is when you look at your statement balance, the number that says this is the minimum payment you have to make. And another variable we're going to observe is the actual payment, which is going to be, we're going to look at the excess payment as how much are people making above the minimum. Yes, please.
Did the policy include any reduction of the credit limits, so they couldn't borrow as much for the shock of the increase of minimum payments?
So the policy from the regulator did not. But we are going to show that endogenously the banks did respond on exactly that margin. That's one of the supply margins that we think about. So to kind of follow up on these questions, this is, for example, one of the groups that was the quote unquote most compliant with the regulator's desire to change the minimum payment. So we're going to have 11 lenders, and we're going to call them by letter. So these lenders, A and B, are in group 2%. You can see, right, in July 2019, in both Ontario and Quebec, the minimum payments were $10 plus interest plus fees. That's all. Right, very simple. Regardless of your balance, $10, interest, and fees. In August 2019, the same remained true in Ontario. But that final column shows the new policy in Quebec, where it was the maximum between 2% of your statement balance or $10. Okay, so that's the policy change that we're going to look at. And again, these are for existing cards. So these are for cards opened prior to the policy change. As of August 1st, 2019, the minimum payments increased to these new levels. That's the first group, 2%. There's a second group that we call the 2.5% group that, again, ex ante, they were identical. But ex post, after the policy change, they decided to take matters into their own hands and actually change to a slightly stricter requirement than the policy required. Okay, so they changed to 2.5% of the statement balance or $10, whichever is bigger. We have a third group, right, that has two banks in it, and these banks changed to 3% of the statement balance or $10. However, just a little caveat here that prior to the policy change, the banks were a little bit different. So one of these banks had $10 plus interest plus fees. The other had a maximum of 1% or $10. Now, in a previous version of this draft that we never circulated, we had separated out these banks, but then our data provider said you can't do that because you need to kind of have not just one bank, so we have to put these two together. Just to keep in mind that it's not as clean as we would love. We would have rather had these as separate groups than we did in the previous versions of the draft. But for now, keep in mind that we have the 2% group, the 2.5% group, and the 3% group. And these are mostly thinking about what the policy change ex post was. And remember, the requirement was just 2%, A lot of banks went to 2.5%, and in our talks, one of those banks, they kind of told us behind closed doors that we don't want to have to manage 5 different levels of cards over 5 years. And then the 3% group, probably the same logic. There's a final group here that we call the Z for zero group. These are banks that were compliant with the policy already. So, like I was saying, in Quebec, there are some banks that were compliant with the policy and they had just chosen to do this, and this is also kind of historically relevant related to Felipe's paper and the 2011 policy. So these 4 banks were compliant before, and they didn't change at all after the policy change. And these actually did show up on the CDF as well. So these are going to be thinking about the implementation of the policy change, and thinking about, first of all, if you look at the whole market, when there's this policy change, how does it change at the card level? How does it change across banks? Right, so if I have many credit cards, one's at bank A, one's at bank C, all of a sudden after the policy change, these cards are now very different. So we're also able to look at how the intra-wallet substitution changes. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, that's what we're working on now. Most of what we've done so far has been looking at card level analysis. Any questions? Okay, so let's talk about what we actually do in terms of our methodology. So it's going to be reduced form. We're going to use 2 primary sources of data. The first is the consumer credit reporting data, courtesy of the Bank of Canada. This is very high quality data. It's monthly data from 2012 all the way to the present of all Canadians with a credit file. And this is the population, right? So I always joke that in the US, the New York Fed has a 10% sample, and that 10% sample is bigger than Canada. Right? Canada is sufficiently small that the bank has all the data. And this is each month, each loan. So not just credit cards, we're going to use credit cards. It has statement balances, payments due, payments made, arrears, and then it has some demographics on the actual card issuers. This is very high quality data. Something that's kind of floating in the back here is that unfortunately this policy runs smack dab into the pandemic. So we're gonna not show anything today that's beyond 6 months after the policy, which is February, March 2020, because we're still thinking through how the pandemic changed things. But we do have that data, and that's also something that we're working on, kind of understanding this analysis and looking at the staggered treatment effect down the road. We're only gonna show kind of the first effect today. So we're also gonna use the Mintel data. This is really cool data. It's monthly data that we have from July 2018 through the beginning of 2020. 8,000 Canadians, it's a monthly panel, and it asks them, tell us about the credit card offers you've received in the mail. This is kind of a survey that's been used in other papers to think about how credit card lenders are soliciting business. And we're gonna use this data to think about the supply side channel that we talked about a little bit. Okay, so very important for us to think about our sample. And we're gonna think carefully about how we construct our sample for the existing card. So of all the data we have, we're going to retain data on 11 lenders that operate in both Quebec and Ontario. This is going to represent 84% of balances in Ontario and 64% of balances in Quebec. Quebec number is much smaller because there's one very large lender in Canada that operates exclusively in Quebec, Desjardins. Right, so Desjardins, they have a little bit of business elsewhere, but we're not going to be able to construct a good control group for them in Ontario, so we exclude them from our analysis. So Desjardins is not in this. If you're from Quebec, that's not too surprising, I think. We're going to exclude cards that are closed, that are in persistent severe arrears, or inactive. So what we're going to do is look at our analysis period, right? Thinking about from month 0 of the policy change going forward. We're not going to touch those months, and we're not going to touch 6 months before. We're going to look even before that, and we're going to say if you're a card that's closed, or active, or in persistent arrears, we're going to throw it out of our sample, because that's going to make our result of delinquency especially look even stronger. So we're going to really think about 12 months or before the policy, we're going to exclude a lot of cards that are inactive, that are not relevant for analysis. We're also going to think carefully about the fact that there are differences in Quebec and in Ontario on demographics and income and those sorts of variables. So we are going to construct a matched sample between Ontario and Quebec, and this is where we're going to really be able to flex the benefits of the data. So credit cards have 16 numbers, right? The first number you're probably familiar with typically indicates the network. So 5 MasterCard, 4 Visa, so on. There's also, the first 6 digits of the card is called the BIN, right? So my daily use credit card from the Bank of Montreal starts with 5191, for example. That is their very standard 1% cashback blue card that everybody has. So we're gonna look at that level of detail per card, and we're gonna look at households in Ontario that have that card and match them to households in Quebec that have that card. So we're going to do a bin level match. By doing a bin level match, and it's also, of course, within bank, because each bank issues its own cards. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at an indicator of whether they're a revolver or a transactor, because that's also a very important predictor of behavior. And then we're going to map in some other covariates. So we're going to look at households that are in Quebec or in Ontario for a given bin, whether they're revolving for credit card borrowers, and have, for example, a high credit limit or a low credit limit. We're going to match on that level, with Quebec being our streaming group, and we're going to construct this matched Ontario group. Ultimately, we're going to have 69 million observations from 5.3 million cards. Any questions here? Okay. So just some summary stats so we have numbers in the back of our heads for the matched sample between Ontario and Quebec. Okay, so we're going to look here for both of these provinces, before and after. And ultimately, for Ontario, the before and after should and do look very similar. That is kind of the whole point. If you look at Quebec, though, for example, the minimum payments, you can see immediately there's that $24 jump in the minimum payment, right? That's going to be our first stage. That's going to be very important for our analysis. And then most of these other things, you can try to look at before and after. That's the first diff. And then the second diff, and diff, is looking at differences over time in Quebec, differences over time in Ontario. So the rest of the analysis is really taking this table, adding a lot more controls, and looking at the difference across all the columns. So I won't get into this too much, just to have a sense of the numbers in the back of our heads. So we're going to use very standard different identification strategy to estimate the causal effects of this policy change. Again, keep in mind the unit of observation is I is 1 card, and T is 1 month. Okay? That's very important for us. We're going to have card and time fixed effect to strengthen our data that we can do kind of all these different things and still have power for our estimates. This indicated Quebec, it's important that it's a card that was opened in Quebec in July 2019. I guess maybe here opened, it should be open. So it was a card that was opened in Quebec in July 2019, so it was opened prior to the policy. And just something to keep in mind here that we've thought a lot about is if you open the card in Quebec, but then you move to Ontario, it's still subject to the Quebec rules, at least as far as our read. This ends up being a very small fraction of people, but just to say that we have kind of thought or tried to think through many of these eventualities and tried to be very careful about how we're labeling things. So if you have any ideas, please let us know. We want to be careful with this. The omitted category for us, so the point on the figures that's not going to have any standard errors, is the month preceding the policy introduction. So the omitted period for us is T or tau equals July 2019. So everything's going to be relative to 1 month before the policy change. The variable that we care about is this delta tau. So these are the dynamic estimated average treatment effects on the treated. Before time 0, so tau being negative, this is checks for pre-trends, and tau positive shows the effects of the policy over time. So in the paper, for example, in our analysis, we have the classic 2x2 difference, but I'm going to show you today all the dynamic treated average effects. We're going to use standard OLS, and we thought carefully about how to cluster our standard errors, so we're going to do them at the consumer level to allow for correlation across cards held by consumers over time. So we thought a lot about should we cluster at the bank level. There's not that many banks, or it's not going to be very effective. But just to say again, we've kind of done all these things. We have them in the paper, or we have them in the appendix, or maybe only in the online appendix at this point. But at least what I'm going to show you today, just to preempt the question, we're clustering at the consumer level for each of these different analyses. And remember, the analysis level is a card level, but we have consumer fixed effects. So we have card fixed effects, and we're clustering at the consumer level. Okay, so it's a little bit all over the place, but we do all the combinations, and it doesn't make a huge difference. Yes.
Could you say a word for why you're doing it at the card level and not the consumer level? Because you think if it's fine for one, maybe I don't like borrowing one card because it has lower interest rate, and so if I have to pay more, I'm just gonna borrow more on the other card. Or, yeah.
So I completely agree, and we here we wanted to think ultimately at the consumer level. So for the consumer level, what I call the wallet level analysis, your argument makes perfect sense. That's what we end up doing. Here we ended up clustering at the consumer level. If we cluster at the card level, it ends up being a maximum of 12 observations over which you're clustering. So we just thought that it would be better to cluster at the consumer level because then at least you're capturing if a shock hits a consumer, like at what level do you have the heteroscedasticity? We think it's more likely to be at the consumer than at the card.
So the question was not about the clustering, it was the actual regression. Why are you doing it at the card level?
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, so exactly right. So the first thing we want to do is look at the card level, just to see at the card level, per card, what are the market movements. Then you're absolutely right. We're ultimately more concerned with looking at the wallet level, but we thought if we start at the wallet level, we're going to find something, we're going to have to go back to the card level. Like I was telling our wonderful discussant, we do have some wallet effects, but we haven't cleared them yet. So what I can say about the wallet level very briefly is that we thought it would be very cool, for example, if consumers substituted away from the high minimum payment cards to lower payment cards. Turns out they don't do much. Not super surprising, but it would have been very nice to see that consumers are very rationally responding to these change incentives, but we're not going to find that. Yes?
Just double checking, all
Sure.
the banks made the change on July 2019, nobody made it earlier, no bank made the change before.
Exactly. So from what you can see in the CDF, that's the only way that we really checked, is look at those CDFs. So we have the July 2019 CDF, that's the pre, and then August 2019 CDF, that is when we really saw this big shift.
Okay, so they didn't, there were no early adopters.
No early adopters, but you're absolutely right that banks did anticipate this was going to happen, and I'll show you that they adjusted on other markets.
And what was the difference between the policy's announcement and August 2019? So how long did people knew this was coming?
So May 2017 was when it was initially kind of tabled, and then it was passed about a year and a half later, and then it started in August 2019.
And do you know when customers received a letter from the bank that this will be coming?
I don't know. That's a good question. No, we should be a bit more. We've looked a lot about the bank's anticipatory effect, not as much on the customer. Thank you. Okay. So what are our main outcome variables? So the first is the minimum payment. And if you use the credit bureau data, you have different kinds of products. So for example, when you look at a mortgage, there's a payment field, and that's the, it's called, for us it's called PAYMT_AMT, payment amount. For mortgages, that's the required payment. For credit cards, it's the minimum payment. So this is directly what the bank has reported to our data provider, TransUnion, about what is the minimum payment. That is the exact field, and this is the payment that's inclusive of interest and fees. So this is exactly what the customer sees on their credit report, on their balance. This is exactly what the consumer sees on their credit card statement, and it's what is reported to the credit bureau. The second field that we construct is what we think is important in terms of revolving debt. So when you're talking about credit cards, you must be very careful, right? If you look at my credit report, I have a ton of credit card debt because I get the balance every month. I don't know what it is anymore, to be honest, and it just automatically gets sucked out of my bank account. But knock on wood, thank God, I've never paid a cent in credit card debt because I make sure to pay the full amount every period. So I have a lot of statement balances, and I have a high minimum payment, sure, but I don't have any revolving debt. The way we construct revolving debt is we take the actual payment, which is a separate field in TransUnion, and we subtract that from the statement balance. And those are timed differently. So you see the statement balance today, right? And then you see on the next statement how much of a payment that you made. And we actually looked at our own credit card statements, for example, and this is exactly how it's constructed. Okay, so when we're going to look at the timing here, this is why we chose July 2019 as being our time equals 0. Because we want to think about the revolving debt today is the balance that I had yesterday minus the payment that I made today. That's revolving debt. It can be negative. For whatever reason, people can overpay. One classic example is when you return stuff on Amazon, for example. You might not have noticed, and then they refund you the amount, but you still pay the full balance, and then you have a negative credit card balance. When we observe that in the data, we just set it to 0, just to make things a bit cleaner, but it doesn't make a big difference overall. That's revolving debt. It's going to be our main outcome variable. Everything I've said about how much less debt people have has been about revolving debt. We're not interested in statement balances per se because they're going to adjust kind of mechanically. We're interested in how much do people revolve over time. Okay, final measure is delinquency. We measure this as any missed payment recorded in the credit report. And credit cards, they're pretty generous with the definition of delinquency, right? So you miss a payment, and then if you've missed it for 30 days after the due date, then they finally mark you as being non-current on the account. So this is really like you've really missed a payment. I think we can exclude people who have forgotten and so on. Okay, so we think we're getting a good measure of here people who are truly kind of non-current on their credit card debt. Okay, any questions? Perfect. So first thing, this is the unconditional means of the minimum payment, so to the question earlier. And here you can kind of see on the consumer side, as well as on the lender side, how much minimum payments were. So there's this slight, so the time index is 0 for August 2019. That's the horizontal axis. The yellow is the treatment group in Quebec, and the black is the control group in Ontario. Ontario is living its best life, no changes, go straight. It's a slightly positive trend because balances are increasing over time. It's really Quebec that you see at the treatment date has a sharp jump up. This is kind of our first stage. This is the raw unconditional data. We run the difference that we just talked about as kind of a test of our first stage, and this is what we get. So in all the figures I'm going to show you, they're going to look like this. We're going to have the estimate on the horizontal, on the vertical axis. The horizontal is time, indexed to 0 being the date of the policy change. -1 here is our omitted time period, that's why there's no standard error there. And then we have the black is the unmatched, and the yellow is the matched. And this is our cleanest figure by far. We see that there's a $23 increase in minimum payments, and the month of the policy change, it's about a 50% increase. Okay, that's our first test. Now we're going to look at revolving debt. So here, kind of same thing. So revolving debt, here it's much harder to see. These are the unconditional means to control the treatment groups. And you can see that, prior, they seem to be following each other pretty well. And then if you look at this really hard, you can't really tell anything at all, unless you're my co-authors who can seem to spot these things immediately. So we run the regressions, and what we find is that it does look like there's a bit of a pre-trend, so we are working on this. And I guess we could have been a little bit less honest and shown, -2 through to +6, but we want to be really clear that work in progress, we're still trying to figure out the matching, how best to think about these two groups. But overall, what we see is that there might have been a little bit of difference beforehand, but there certainly is a decrease in the post-policy period. So we think this is pretty clear. $64 decrease in revolving debt after the policy change, after 6 months. And to be clear, again, this is balances minus actual payments. Those actual payments are a function of the minimum payments. You can choose to make a minimum payment, you can choose not to make a minimum payment, but we're seeing that for whatever reason, and we think it's causal, is that in time 0, there's this stark decrease in revolving debt. Delinquency, this is the one that's a lot noisier, and we're still kind of digging into this. Part of the reason it's a lot noisier is that it's a discrete variable, and the level itself is very low, as I was saying. What we observe in both the unmatched and the matched is that there is some noise in the pre-period, especially going further back. But after the policy change, there is this kind of big increase. In levels, it's 0.1 percentage points. On a base of 1%, it's about 10%. So again, that might seem large, it might seem small. Our goal is to quantify it and say it is happening. We can't bear our heads in the sand and say that the policy is completely innocuous. Right? It is happening, that people are becoming more delinquent after August 2019. Now, I want to zoom in a little bit in the little bit of time I have left on a couple more subsamples. So, like I was saying, we want to look at revolvers versus transactors in Quebec and in Ontario. So, we're going to define a revolver as someone who pays less than the statement balance in the majority of the observed period. And this is not our definition, it's used in the literature. We can make this stricter as someone who always pays the full balance and so on, but we're going to pick the majority here just for now. It's not too sensitive. Overall, we can see kind of the big thing to keep in mind is that, revolvers not only revolve, but they also revolve much more debt. So the idea here is revolvers, if you look at the line that says statement balance, right? Revolvers here have a lot more credit card debt in general, and relative to transactors. And the whole point of being a revolver is that, the whole point of being a transactor is that your payments are basically this full amount every month, whereas if you're a revolver, you're not making a full payment. So these are people who have a larger statement balance and have a smaller payment. So let's look at their behavior. You can see the policy date hits, the transactors increase their minimum, the minimum payments increase for transactors, but the whole point here is that that's not binding. So I have no idea what my minimum payments are on my credit card because I just make the full payment anyways. It's set up to do it automatically. So I'm not really salient to that. The revolvers, however, they are relatively salient because they're not making the full payment. It's not set up to pay off the full balance. So this is the first stage. Again, it kind of shows up, makes sense. It's higher for the revolvers, they have a higher balance. If you look at the excess balance, for the transactors, it doesn't change. It's exactly what you'd expect. Right? The new policy is not binding for them. They're not making the minimum payments anyways. So there's no change in excess balance, which should be 0. Right? There's no difference from that. The revolvers, again here, to be perfectly honest, still kind of thinking through that pre-trend, why is it different? But you can see that this has a much more negative slope. It's decreasing and it's almost $150. Okay, so that's for the revolvers versus transactors. I only have a couple minutes left. Okay. One other thing we can look at, and we're working through this as well, is again, we have these 4 different groups. The Z group has no exposure, and then we have the 2% group, 2.5%, and 3%. And again, this is the card levels at the Taha's point. We're looking here more carefully at substitution across the groups and not finding much, to be honest. But we can at least look at the heterogeneous treatment effect across these groups. So first stage, sanity check, the minimum payments. For the Z group in yellow, there's no change at all, right? Because these guys are not exposed to policy change. They're already compliant. And then for the different groups, The interesting thing is that it's not monotonically increasing in the policy. So the 3% group does not have a larger minimum payment because it turns out the 3% group, for whatever reason, has a smaller average payment balance anyways. So this is where it's really important to think about the different banks and how they're different overall. So we don't want to make any bold claims here. We're still thinking about the best way to kind of even show this, but just preliminarily I thought it was interesting to look at. We do have kind of interesting variation in the excess balance. That Z group is kind of 0, as you'd expect, and screwing up the figures a little bit with these wide centered errors. And then the other groups have the same patterns as before to varying degrees. Okay, in the last 2 or 3 minutes, very preliminary work on the supply of credit. So this is important to think about. On the one side there's household demand, and we've shown that there's an increase in debt, and there's a decrease in debt, increase in delinquency. Now we want to think about how are the lenders responding to this policy. Work in progress, like I said, we're using the Mintel data to gauge the supply of debt before and after the policy change. So overall, we have evidence that just prior to the policy coming in effect, the lenders are very aware that all of a sudden there's going to be a big change to their business. All new cards are going to have 5%. So what they do is they offer lower interest rates, they offer lower annual fees, and they offer higher credit card limits. Okay, so I'm going to show you some evidence to suggest this. This is consistent at the card level with lenders kind of wanting to lock in consumers to this pre-policy card. Right, once you lock them into the pre-policy card, then you have kind of at least 5 years where you can charge them a lower minimum payment. On the wallet side, there's also this idea where you get a new card and that's your new daily spend. Right? So the lenders are trying to become top of mind or top of wallet for households. By saying, here, look, there's a brand new fancy card, we want you to use this card. And this is thinking about the wallet composition, right? Which card are households actually using, and does that change the policy? So this is something that we're working on now as well. So very, very preliminary, just to kind of show you raw numbers. We don't want to make any bold things, but we'll show you what we're working with here. This is, we look at all of the offers that go out to households that they report to us, and there's 2 kinds of offers. Either it's a brand new card, or it's a retention, where they either want you to renew your card a bit early to lock in the date, or they want you to upgrade to a new card. You have the Visa Infinite, they want you to upgrade to the Visa Infinite Platinum. And how will they entice you to do that? By sending you an offer in the mail. So these retention offers really skyrocketed in Quebec just prior to the policy change. What do these look like? Well, there's a lower APR, but the timing is a bit unusual, right? The timing of the lower APR, it drops by about 3 percentage points in May 2019. And then it kind of shoots up a little bit, but this is, not the same timing as the last slide and also well before the policy. But there is this evidence in Quebec that they try to entice people to sign up by having, or we think they're trying to entice people to sign up by having a lower APR. And similarly, the average fee on these credit cards around that May 2019, so in conjunction with the lower APR, there's this downward trend in that downward spike in the average fee, but then it does seem to shoot up around August 2019. So that's something that we're not sure what's going on there, but we're exploring it. And finally here, evidence of a larger credit. So one thing you might think about is, the marginal propensity to borrow out of the borrowing limit, which we know is not 0. It's kind of surprising. People, you give them more rope and they will not hang themselves with it, more rope and they will borrow more. So here we see that the credit limit increases in Quebec quite a bit around that, about 6 months before the policy, but then it kind of does decrease in August 2019. So again, we're also exploring this channel. So this is all work in progress to show you that we do think the supply side is very active. It's not just households that are responding to policy. The banks are preemptively kind of trying to change their dynamics. So I'll conclude here. Big picture takeaway from this paper is to think about not just nudges, not just information disclosure, but this paternalism, restricting consumer choice as a tool that policymakers can use to help households improve their financial health. There's this overtone of Big Brother that people typically don't like, but beyond that, we also need to think carefully about the trade-offs. Right? Who does it help? Who does it harm? And we want to think specifically in this paper about increasing credit card minimum payments. And how do you evaluate the policy? Well, it's difficult to say, right? As policymakers, that is their jobs. We at least want to bring to the table evidence of the costs and the benefits and try to quantify those. After 6 months, there is a decrease in credit card debt of $64, and it's even larger for revolvers. And there is an increase in delinquency. So both of these channels are active, and the policymakers can decide to say whether or not they think this is on net a good thing, on net a bad thing. And next steps for our paper, we want to continue to study the effect on the supply of credit card debt, as well as, so I was saying, the composition of wallets. We want to think about, are people changing a lot of their behavior on that intensive margin about which card to use? Answer so far seems to be no. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael. It was a pleasure to read, coming from Quebec, knowing the policy a bit, hearing about the policy. I know there's people, regulators in the room, so maybe you're also interested in knowing the effects. So really interesting paper. I think someone needed to write that paper. The Quebec Foundation should read the paper. So here's my take. Credit cards have high interest rates, 20% APR. And we know from previous work, so I've done work with Stephen on minimum payment, and Ben Keys and Jalan Wang studied minimum payments, and about 20 to 30% of the population pay the minimum. Okay, Stephen and I had one change at one bank that increased the minimum from 3 to 5%, and luckily we had a control group of unaffected borrowers, so we were able to study the effect, with a control group of increasing minimum payments from 3 to 5%. And then Keys and Wang had all the changes in the US from all the banks. So they had even more variation in terms of minimum payments, and they were able to construct really an interesting model about anchoring the minimum payments. The issue is if you only pay the minimum, it's going to take years to pay down your debt. That's what you hear. And then regulators, policymakers might be concerned that consumers are going to be trapped in debt forever. Okay, so there's two views in my sense. There's two views about these minimum payments. First thing, borrowers could be paying the minimum because it's the cheapest source of fund for them. Okay, there's still payday loans out there. There's still a bunch of pricey loans that are more expensive than the 20% APR on the card. So once you increase the minimum payment, they either have to switch to more expensive funds, spend less, or default. Go delinquent. The second view, which is maybe the view that policymakers in Quebec had, is, well, people paying the minimum are not doing the right thing. Okay, it's not the right payment, it's not the optimal payment. We need to nudge them, we need to force them to pay more on their debt, and people would be made better off by increasing the payments on the credit card. So I think that's well summarized in your paper. I think that's it. So this policy you explained very well. Existing cards need to increase to 2%, and then gradually by 2025, next year, they'll all reach 5% minimum payments. The new accounts need to have 5% minimum payments. So there's quite a big gap there. And then there's heterogeneity at the bank level in the baseline minimum payments, as you showed. There's also information on the credit card statement that was added at the same time. So if you know the Card Act in 2009 in the US, on the statement they were showing you two things: the amount of time it's going to take you to pay back your balance if you make the minimum payment, and the minimum payment you need to make to pay down the balance in 36 months. In Quebec, we just kept the first one. Like, how long is it going to take if you just make the minimum payment? But still, that's another piece of information that was added. Studying the Card Act, Sumit Agarwal and co-op just show that there's not a big effect of these disclosures, but still, it's a disclosure essentially. So here's your first stage. I think it's really clean. Minimum payments increase. It increases by $23, 0.5% of the balance. But it should affect people who pay near minimum amounts on a credit card. So you think like 20% of people, 30% of people pay the minimum. It's increasing by $23. I'm not sure if the average effect on revolving debt is really what's going to be the big selling feature of this policy. Okay, and that's something we found also when we worked with this data. You look at total revolving debt, and it's not clear that this is where the action is coming from. So this is pretty clear. I think then spending, repayment, this is really less clear. In my view, maybe you have a different read than me, but there's no huge changes around the policy change. You'd think revolvers might be more affected than less, but that's not necessarily what you see. Repayment kind of similar. I think it's becoming a bit more murky, at least at the average, even looking at revolvers and transactors. And delinquency is also fuzzy. So in terms of delinquency, what we had found when we did our study was that basically, as you said, this is just a binary variable. And what could be happening is that once you start being delinquent, the increase in the minimum payment really adds up. It does a snowball effect. So I think what you want to look at is transition into and out of delinquency. And for us, that really made the change. Actually, when we had this one bank, which is a North American bank in our paper, so we don't know what country it's from, but that North American bank was looking at delinquency as a binary variable and was saying, we don't understand what's going on. So that tells you the level of sophistication of the bank. And we came in and did the full Markov transition. We had within delinquency cycle. And we really showed that it's as you become more and more delinquent that this in our case, 3 to 5 really bundle up. Right? You go from 3 to 5 to 15, you know, just do that math, but it's really getting out of delinquency that was hard for people. We actually saw no effect or minimum effect on becoming delinquent, like being current to going delinquent. So I'm sure that if you try this, I don't know how far you can go with the data, I'm sure you can clean this graph a bit better, okay? So that would be one thing. Then, I'm showing statement balance. I should have shown revolving balance, but it's the same graph. It's trending, right? It seems like it's trending down. I'm not sure. So I'm not sure I see an effect, strong effect of the policy on revolving balance. And I'm not sure if on average you would expect it. And okay, I'll keep nitpicking on one thing, because in the paper you say about Keys and Wang's and mine and Stephen's paper, you say we're not designed and we don't have the power to do revolving debt. I mean, we had 5 million accounts. We had, I think, a larger change in minimum payment. I would more say, like, no one's really designed to look at average revolving balance when you're thinking about an increase of minimum payments of $23. That's maybe the only thing I said. I don't think it's fair to, like, Keys had all the changes from the US, and we had a control group, we had a decent change in minimum payment. But I think we had the same feeling as you that, are we really finding something there? However, what we were struggling with was, are people substituting away from the card? Okay, because we saw a decrease in spending for near minimum payers. So then the theory says, well, is it because you're liquidity concerned, you're spending less, or are you shifting around? And that's where I think you have really cool and novel data to address this. And this goes back to Taha's point, which I think is like the thing you should be focusing on. There's this other paper of John Gatorgood in the AER, and you don't cite it currently, but I suspect you know this paper. It's another paper using the wallet of credit cards, and it talks about the balance matching heuristic. And it says, well, people pay down a fraction of their balance, it's the same fraction across cards. And I think that's where your contribution can really shine, okay? You said you already did some work, but whether you find that people adjust or not, I think you have interesting things to say. So just in general, I think if you see people who are near minimum payers, they're switching away to another card, that tells you that they're doing something smart, okay? They want to pay the minimum, maybe it's the cheapest source of funds for them, maybe they're optimally moving to the right card. But if they're not, I think it's also fine. You're basically saying people anchor to the minimum, and it's kind of evidence that maybe they're not doing what's optimal. Okay, so you would have to dig a bit into interpreting these results, but I think there's something nice to be done here. The other point you mentioned is you say you can see the type of card and the rewards. Last year at this conference we had Andrea Presbitero, or 2 years ago, talking about who pays for your rewards, and I think you can link really nicely with that paper also by showing do you stick to high reward cards even if the minimum payment increase? I think there's a lot of variation you can exploit in your data. So that's really what I would push you to do. Do the wallet analysis. That's where your contribution is really going to shine, because showing an increase in delinquency, decrease in revolving balance, it's been done a little bit already. You have something cool here, a new policy, but I think this makes it a clear contribution. On top of that, you have these new cards, which are 5%. That's a big switch. Currently, you didn't talk about that, but we do a simple difference in the paper, and I don't understand why. I would look at new cards opened before and after the policy. I'd run the same diff and diff, and I'd look at what's going on at the card level, and more importantly, I'd do it at the consumer level. Okay, so we've been talking about mortgage lock-in in the US. Is there a credit card lock-in effect? So you're a minimum payer on your card, you enjoy that 2%, that sweet 2% minimum payment, and now if you want to get a new card, you have to go up to 5%. Does that lock you into your old card? Okay, and that's something you can do at the consumer level. You just look at the share of spending on all the cards, and how much are you spending on a new card, on an old card, the probability of opening a new card, and then you'd get, another interesting result, which we weren't able to do, and Keys and Wands weren't able to do because they only had access to account level information. They weren't able to link at the wallet level. So I really think you have something interesting here, and I push you to go the extra mile and do the wallet analysis. I think no matter what you find, the story is interesting. There's a pitch there. So just do it that way. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Interesting paper. I would think that the policy was intended not to have a big effect. So I'm not surprised that we're not finding like crazy big effect. They staggered the rollout precisely not to disrupt the market too much. But the big novelty I hear from your data is this wallet of cards. So I would push you to do as much as you can on that front. And I really look forward to reading the next draft. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. So, everyone always says it, but that is really the perfect assessment of this paper. So, thank you. Yeah, I mean, all your points very well taken. We are very excited to also submit, put out the next draft. We have some of the things you said. I think especially the delinquency is great because we did play with hazard rates, but not transitions. That's a great point, right? The transition, especially when the level is relatively low, you are thinking about, so that's a great point. A few things, I mean, there's, this idea of the spending. I think it's interesting for us. It's really showing that, consistent with the earlier papers, it is a lot about anchoring. So the fact that people are reducing their balances, are reducing their spending, implies that they're able to make that higher minimum payments, and it doesn't affect their spending. So for us, that's kind of not too surprising. The point about, should we expect a market level effect? I think that's also a strength that this was a broad policy change. So in your paper, it's the one bank in North America. Keys and Jane, there was, some banks implemented this, but here it's really this broad push. So I completely agree that you wouldn't expect to see something at the market level. The fact that you do is also kind of interesting, is that this is a change that is kind of small, 2%, and it's for a huge fraction of the market is completely unaffected, and yet we see in the aggregate numbers that credit card debt went down. So we think that's interesting, and that's something that the regulators can say, hey, look, we made a change, and it had a market level effect. So I have lots of thoughts, everything, and we'll talk more and get some of the slides hopefully, but thank you so much, it was very, very helpful.
Awesome, thanks. We have 5 minutes for more question, discussion about the paper.
Please.
So just to reiterate on this idea of focusing on the consumer as opposed to the card, I kind of understand the points about the way that people choose what cards to use and so on and so forth. But I would expect that where you will get a lot of bite is on the other outcomes, in spending, consumption, delinquency. Basically if you're pushed to make a bigger payment in this card, that actually may trickle down your overall consumption, your delinquency in other cards, and so on and so forth. So I think that interaction is something that you could explore.
Absolutely, and I think what's nice for us is that many people have one card, most people have 2 cards. So we specifically look at people who have, for example, this is what we've done already, 2 cards, one in Treatment Group 2%, one in Treatment Group 3%, and we look at how they change behavior over the 2 cards. And we don't find much. Part of that is we also must keep in mind the fact that on the supply side, the banks are very active kind of participants here. So think about it from the bank perspective, right? Prior to the policy change, I'm a bank and I issue a card and I have whatever minimum payment. After the policy change, and it's a competitive market, that's key. After the policy change, I'm a bank that has Michael as a customer, and now I'm effectively a monopolist over that customer. Because if Michael opens a new card anywhere in Quebec, it's 5%. He can no longer get this 2% card that I hold with him. So the bank is also responding a lot, and that's what we're working on as well, showing. So I totally agree that it's interesting, and I think it's actually very complicated. Think about households are kind of shifting over cards, but banks are also internalizing with less information that they now have some market power over that consumer with that one card. So that's where it's a bit murky exactly, but I totally agree with what you're saying. Yes?
Small question first. How do you deal with attrition, cards closed? Is it a balance?
So we, prior and during the matching, yes, it is a balance sample. We think of closure as an outcome variable. So we
You
actually,
didn't study it.
we didn't show it, no, but we do have it where, I don't know if you know if it's in the draft, but it is important to us, right? You think about exactly for this idea of, if I had 2 cards prior that I was active on, one was 2%, now one goes to 3%, do I close that 1 card? So that is something that we look at. We don't find much right now. Again, it doesn't seem like it's a very big margin, but I think, you know, to explain is that we should definitely look even more carefully at specifically revolvers and look. And then the good thing is we do have enough data that we can do those kind of double and triple cuts and still have enough people to say something.
And then to your introduction, your basically the story you wrap around your analysis, I am not 100% clear yet that this hard paternalism is good for consumers. So are you 100% sure that this was, how do you evaluate whether it was actually good for consumers? So I studied the term and policies, and I'm not going away from this 100% convinced that it is measured that it is good for consumers.
Sure, so I want to be careful that I don't think we can conclude that it's good for consumers. So my day job, I'm a structural modeler, and I would say you need a model to do proper welfare analysis. So here at least we're trying to quantify on the delinquency side, delinquency goes up. On the balance side, balances go down. Is it good for consumers? Is it not good for consumers? I think that's a decision that policymakers kind of have to evaluate day to day. And for me, I don't think this paper we can make any of those kinds of statements.
So you pitched it in the beginning as this is a new way to go for regulators and something, and then it's a bit like one kind of expects the story. It's like a trailer promises this, and then the movie.
Well, I thought, so that's a point well taken. I thought that our attempt was to pitch it as we want to quantify the trade-offs, and then we'll leave it to the policymaker to evaluate whether or not they're good or bad. So we put forth some estimates of the trade-offs and whether it's good or bad, it ultimately depends. If you put all your weight on reducing debt, great policy. If you have infinite negative weight on increasing delinquency, bad policy. So ultimately depends how you weigh these things.
Fair enough.
Yes.
I wonder how much of the effect is driven by the sorting effect. Like after this policy, like the people who are less financial constrained, they're more financially affluent, they're gonna use this card or at least use as much as they used to spend the card. And so the borrower characteristics also kind of change after this policy. I just wonder, and those people also can have a lower level of debt. So I just wonder how much they're gonna influence.
Yeah, we haven't, that's a great point. We haven't done those kinds of cuts by ex ante characteristics. So for example, we have credit score. We don't have much on individual demographics other than age and location. But what we have done is, at the Bank of Canada, the data set that we're using has the 3-digit postal code. So, in Canada, it's 6 digits, we have the first 3. So we can look at, high income areas versus low income areas, things like that. So we have that, but we haven't done it, but that's a good point. Thank you.
Michael, just a great paper.
Thanks.
Congrats. More structural question on the credit card, 16 digits. These structure follows the same, same thinking across jurisdictions. Is this something across the world? Are you the first one to use this? Can you do it, for example, these 6 digits after, if it's MasterCard or Visa? Can you use across Visa or MasterCard? Because, when you choose a card, you have the bank offers you maybe more than one, and you can kind of choose one or another. And could be Visa, MasterCard, both.
Yeah.
Can you do this analysis? Quebec and Ontario, but maybe across different type of operators?
So I'm not sure if I understand the question. Are you asking whether or not that 16 digits is in Canada and in the world? Or?
In the world, yes.
So I don't know if it's in the world.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure credit cards all over the world are 16 digits. I think.
It would be really.
Yeah, it would be bizarre. But some phone numbers look bizarre to me, so I have no idea. At least in Canada, it certainly is the case that, the Bank of Montreal, my Bank of Montreal card is the card that I have memorized. If I have it online and it seems somewhat suspicious, I use that card because they can scam me on that card, no problem. So I know that card is their vanilla card and it is offered in every province with the same 6 digits. So if we do the matching, we're able to exploit that level of the first 6 digits. Otherwise, I'm not sure, but that's something we can look into, I think, if you have a specific kind of what you think is super important about that. But it is related to the discussion, that's how we're matching that BIN to whether or not it's a platinum card that has different rewards, those kinds of things. So that is another way we can use those 6 digits. For now, just the matching is what we're using it for.
Thanks.
Awesome. I think we're gonna move on to the next presenter. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you so much.
And, the next